Hello, everyone. My name is Lisa Williams. I am the Associate Curator at the New Britain Museum of American Art, and I'm so very delighted to welcome you to our current exhibition, Someday is Now, Women, Art, and Social Change. And I'm thrilled to see some familiar faces, some of our beloved docents. It's been such a long time since we've had you here in the museum, so I'm happy to at least see you virtually. Someday is Now opened just last week on October 1st, and the exhibition is part of the museum's major initiative entitled 2020 20 Plus Women at NBMAA, which launched in January of this year. The initiative seeks to address the disparity in the representation of women and artists of color in museums and the arts in general. And so throughout 2020, we have dedicated all of our special exhibitions, as well as permanent collection installations and acquisitions, to female identifying artists to really celebrate their contributions to the arts. So I want you all to feel welcome, to let me know if you can't hear me. If I'm talking too fast, you can just wave or chat a comment in the chat window, and I will try to respond. I also want to welcome everyone to feel that they can interject with a question at any time. I'm recording on a very small camera, but I can see when questions pop up. All right, so I'm hoping that perhaps a few of you have had an opportunity to visit the show in person. It will be on view until January 24th, so you've got lots of time. But in the meantime, we will be offering programs both in person and virtually. So this is the first of our live cast tours. This is a complete experiment for me, so thank you for bearing with me. And but I'm really, really proud to bring this show to you. For those of you who are familiar with the museum, you might notice that I am at the top of our second floor stair landing. I'm getting a little bit of echo. I don't know if anybody else is, but okay, looking great. Thank you. All right. So I'm at the top of our second floor stair landing, and I'm just going to swing you around. I'm literally going to be touring you through our space. So just to orient you, when you enter the museum, you'll come up our staircase. Here's our LeWitt family staircase up to our second floor. So the first part of the show that you'll encounter is here in PB Stanley. And you cannot miss these bright, vibrant orange banners that you see behind me that spell out a phrase, which I will read to you. So this is a work by contemporary artist Colleen Smith. It's the first work that you encounter in the building. And I will just note that the show does expand outside of the galleries, actually outside of the museum. So when you visit the museum, please do look at the flagpole to see Yoko Ono's Imagine Peace flag. So the exhibition has transcended the bounds of the gallery, so you'll be able to find aspects of it throughout the museum. So Colleen Smith is a contemporary artist who was trained as a filmmaker, but has increasingly incorporated objects into her work. And she has frequently created banners as art that she then activates in public space as part of political protests or theatrical processions. And this is a piece called Sojourners, and it actually spells the phrase, and I'll take you through. At dawn, sit at the seat of action. At noon, be at the hand of might. And at eventide, be so big that sky will learn sky. This is a phrase by Alice Coltrane, who was a musician and a spiritual advisor. And this was a kind of spiritual revelation that she had, and also in a way, a call to action for women. And this was in the 1970s. And so Colleen Smith today is recapturing this phrase and placing it on these banners as a way to honor this woman from our past. And the work itself is titled Sojourner, in honor of women's activist Sojourner Truth, who comes up frequently in this exhibition. This series of banners was actually activated in an associated video, also called Sojourner, that Colleen Smith made in 2018, that follows 12 women of color through the landscapes of Los Angeles, Joshua Tree, and Chicago, as a way to honor the legacy of Sojourner Truth and the struggles that she faced, and to honor the journey that they continue on today. So now that we've looked at this work, I'm going to take you into the exhibition proper. So here we go, into McKiernan Gallery. And when you visit the museum, you will find yourselves here. Someday is now, Women, Art, and Social Change. So as I mentioned, this exhibition is part of our 2020 initiative, in which we're celebrating the incredible contributions of women artists. I'm going to try to center you on this wall. And of all of the exhibitions in our year's programming, this is the one show to most explicitly address the anniversary of women's suffrage in America and all of the efforts that went into securing the right to vote. And the way that we address this anniversary is by incorporating ephemera from the women's suffrage movement. Here we are. We have the introductory text just to orient you in the space. And then I'm going to take you so that we can take a closer look at some of this visual media from the women's suffrage movement. So the show does not necessarily look in depth at the events of the women's suffrage movement, but more so the visual media that was developed. So in the late 1800s and early 1900s, members of the women's suffrage movement developed eye-catching visual media that often combined text and image as a way to express messages of social change, educate the public about the women's suffrage movement, and also eventually galvanize politicians into making policy change, including the eventual ratification of the 19th Amendment, guaranteeing women the right to vote. And so this show really looks closely at this visual media, which scholar Allison Lang, who's going to be joining us next week in a lecture entitled Picturing Political Power, she talks about the women's suffrage movement as being one of the first and most extensive visual campaigns in American history. So it was a major, major effort, a major visual campaign, and many suffragists formed publication committees and design committees so that they could create these bulletins and banners and posters and sashes that would communicate extremely effectively, like a great, strong marketing campaign. And so you'll see very sort of simple graphic posters here. These are all on loan from Harvard libraries. And just to kind of take a look at some of the designs a little bit more closely. Votes for Women. Up top, you'll see this: for the long workday, for the taxes we pay, for the laws we obey. We want something to say. And a lot of these, I think, resonate with our contemporary moment as well. Among the posters, you'll see references to classical antiquity and associations with virtue and truth. There are also posters that utilized statistics and maps. Because Western states awarded suffrage before the Eastern states, many of these maps depicting suffrage gains were very impressive and sort of showed impending victory or suggested impending victory for the suffragists. These states here in white were those that had already awarded suffrage. Those in black were those still awaiting. This is a great illustration by artist Rose O'Neill. She was a prominent illustrator. She made many kind of iconic posters, and she was also the first to design this sort of Kewpie doll. So you'll see these Kewpies in many of her works. And so here we have children advocating for women in this poster under the banner, "Give Mother the Vote, we need it. Vote for our mothers, for our food, our health, our play, our homes, our schools, our work." And then finally, another really wonderful image. So I'm going to take you over to a few additional posters, and I'm going to try to roll this slowly so that you don't get seasick. So you see a few more examples from what is called the Alice Park Collection of Women's Suffrage Ephemera at Harvard Libraries, this really wonderful triptych. And again, you have this sort of classical figure, the herald, spreading good news, spreading messages of change. I want to show you also, if I can, a little bit of a close-up of this vitrine, which is right behind me, because in addition to the suffrage ephemera, we also have images from the suffrage movement. And this is just a little sneak peek, so you'll have to come back in person to see more clearly. But we have some historic photography. Here's a women's suffrage march happening in Hartford, Connecticut. This is on loan from the Connecticut Historical Society. And this image is included to really show how women had strategically dressed in light colors, white in particular, so that when marches were photographed and reproduced in newspapers, the suffragists would stand out in halftone photographs, so that those white garments really stood out. This is a really fascinating image here of a sculptors guild marching in a women's suffrage rally in New York City. It's the only known photograph of the Sculptors Guild in a suffrage event. And then we also have photographs from the 1950s of Black and African American women at voter registration events. And so you see them here holding really wonderful posters. Let's vote now. Get with the action. They are voting. Are you? And so one thing that these images sort of address, for those wondering why we've included historical images from the women's suffrage movement as well as images from the 1950s, is really to point out some of the segregation that existed in the women's suffrage movement. African American women were often excluded from participating in some of the leading suffrage groups led by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and Lucy Stone. So Black women had to organize independently, and while they were often invited to participate in marches, they had to march in the back. So part of this, this look back at the suffrage movement is to also kind of expose some of that discrimination that existed at the time, and that continued after the ratification of the 19th Amendment. So that the images of Black and African American women at voter registration rallies really kind of shows the challenges that they continue to face decades after that 1920 ratification of the 19th Amendment. The fact that states imposed discriminatory practices, including poll taxes, literary tests, and voters often also experienced intimidation and even violence that prevented them from casting a ballot. So we look at that here in the sort of introductory space, as well as in the exhibition itself. So what this exhibition really seeks to do is look at the visual ephemera that emerged out of the women's suffrage, look at some of these visual strategies that were employed then, and then reflect upon how artists in the subsequent century continued to employ similar visual strategies to spread messages of social change. The exhibition also explores the sort of multiplicity of issues that were tied up in efforts to gain the right to vote, so that women suffragists were not only aiming to obtain the vote singularly, but they wanted that vote so that they would have social and political equity, so that they would be able to manage their finances, run a business, own property, sign contracts, be able to divorce. There were a whole host of rights that came with the vote and that they wanted to fight for. So the remaining exhibition really looks at the multiplicity of issues that artists then continue to address in their efforts towards gaining women's rights and social justice. So those are just a few of the things that really informed the organization of the show. And so thinking about the graphic quality of these posters, the manner in which suffragists combined image and text, we're going to see a lot of that in this show. So when you come into the exhibition, beyond this introductory space, you're going to see works by women artists, 22 women artists, who also combine image and text to convey strong, powerful, inspirational messages of change. So I just want to pause briefly and see if there are any questions. Feel free to chime in at any time. Okay, and I'm also going to keep my eye on the time. Okay, great. So let's take a look at McKiernan Gallery. I'm just going to pan the gallery to kind of orient you. So we come out of this introductory space, and in total we have about 80 works, 80 sculptures, works on paper, paintings. All right, so there's quite a lot of work on view, and we'll only cover a small selection in this first gallery tour, but we'll be offering these walkthroughs regularly so that we can talk about hopefully all of the work in great depth over the course of the show. And the way that the exhibition is organized is loosely chronologically. So once you pass through the women's suffrage ephemera and enter the rest of the exhibition, we really kind of launch here in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, thinking about America during the time of the civil rights movement, and thinking about some of the conditions that we spoke about a few minutes ago in terms of the racism and discrimination that marginalized communities continue to face.
You're not on.
Works on view are by extraordinary women artists who became known in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and really responded to the civil rights movement in particular. And while there are contemporary works in this section, most of them are informed by the civil rights movement and struggles for equality that continue today. So I want to start off here at this really incredible work by Faith Ringgold, who is one of the most celebrated African-American artists of our day. She is known for creating beautiful narrative quilts. We're lucky to have a print by Faith Ringgold in our collection. But this is work that I think is really strong and really speaks to the themes of this show. So this is called Declaration of Independence and Freedom. This was created in 2009. And I'm going to step out of the frame so that you can hopefully take a look at some of the images without my blocking the view. So in this series, each work that you see is juxtaposed, juxtaposes two contrasting images under an iconic national motto. So the first image here is called All Men Are Created Equal. And it depicts King George III of England towering over his subjects on the left, while on the right, a ship sails for America tightly packed with African slaves. So we see that the stark contrast between these images exposes the hypocrisy of the title phrase. Colonial Americans who sought freedom from the tyranny of monarchy did not extend that freedom to Africans, right? So let's have like a close look here. You can see King George, you can see the ship. And then I want to just take a quick look here at the second work, which is particularly resonant with this show. And this is entitled, And Women, ? This work juxtaposes portraits of two leading activists for women's rights. So on the right, here we see an image of Sojourner Truth, and her portrait is overwritten with the text of her speech, Ain't I a Woman?, which advocated for voting rights and gender equality. And on the left, we see an image of Abigail Adams that is overwritten with the text of a letter to her husband, John Adams, imploring him to consider the rights of women while drafting the Declaration of Independence. Faith Ringgold described that in in creating this work that this was one of the most difficult works that she ever made. And for her, she was really reconciling some of the myths of the founding of America, some of the myths of American values, such as all men are created equal, with the reality that she understood, the sort of lived experience as an African American. And I want to share with you her really beautiful narrative quilt called Working Women, 1996. You see this group of sort of empowered women with the backdrop of the city and the American flags. Here, the protagonists are sort of balancing work and family life. You see professionals, you see teachers and children. And this is sort of Faith Ringgold at her strongest. The organization of this show was really exciting because we made some great discoveries along the way. As we spoke to artists and gallerists, we were told to look at the work of some makers, some artists with whom I wasn't familiar with previously. And Amina Brenda Lynn Robinson was one of those artists that was kind of a really wonderful discovery in the process of organizing this show. She's represented by the same gallery that also represents Faith Ringgold. And she was a native of Columbus, Ohio, and really looked at issues that her community was facing, issues that she experienced as a Black woman. And while this work was made in 2012, it feels as if it could have been made in the 1950s or 60s. So let's take a closer look. We see three figures holding up protest signs: Vote Power to the People, Human Rights Day Rally 2012, Occupy the Dream, and this is actually the title of the work, Occupy the Dream. And you see some really interesting assemblage components like buttons and even plastic bags. Okay, we have a suite of really beautiful Elizabeth Catlett works here. There is a woman in every color, Black is beautiful, links together, works that really express women empowering each other. I'm going to turn around and bring you over to a group of sculptures by Betty Starr. And let's try to get a close-up here. Betty Starr is a Los Angeles-based artist who has been deservedly receiving a lot of recognition recently. She's had major solo shows in the past year at MoMA, at the Morgan Library, on the West Coast as well. And her work often looks at derogatory images of Black culture, and she appropriates these images to give them sort of agency and power. And I just want to read a quote by Starr that expresses that her artistic practice has always been a lens through which she has seen and moved through the world around her. It continues to be an arena and medium for political protest and social activism. Here she transforms the derogatory image of Aunt Jemima, who was always kind of a figure of servitude, and she transforms her into a female warrior figure in many of her works, fighting for Black liberation and women's rights. And yet Betty Starr says there's much more work that needs to be done. So this work is called Liberate 25 Mammies. And so you have this Aunt Jemima figure. And Betty Starr often uses assemblage techniques, sculptural techniques. And as a mother of several children, has often kind of incorporated play or games in her works. And so here you see behind each door little die, some of which spell out the word liberate. She uses very subtle techniques. So in this work, we see this rather derogatory image of a mammy figure in the kitchen making bread. And the text here, this was clearly an advertisement for some kind of baking powder. And Betty Starr has crossed out the D so that the text, instead of saying powder, says power. So again, I'm not sure how well you can see from where you are, but I hope that's that'll whet your appetite so that you can come for some closer looking when you have an opportunity to visit the museum. So let's back up. Now we're transitioning from the 40s and 50s, we're transitioning to the 60s and 70s. So we're looking at the civil rights movement, but also some of the issues that emerged out of the Vietnam War, protests for peace, the women's liberation movement that emerged during this time. And if there's one artist that addressed all of these issues, all of these sort of social, political conditions of her time, it's Sister Corita Kent. And we have a suite of vibrant, bold silk screens behind me. And I'll get a little bit closer so you can appreciate, but for the moment, I'll stand back so that you can take it all in. Sister Corita Kent was from Los Angeles, and at the age of 18, she joined a Roman Catholic school where she taught. And during her time there, she began to pursue seriography or silkscreen, and actually at the same time got a master's in art history. So she was really interested in art, and she used art as a way to combine her sort of spiritual readings, her spiritual convictions, and to comment on contemporary issues. So in order to create these works, she appropriated images from mass media, usually clipping photographs from Time magazine or Newsweek. So you'll see some imagery here, some imagery here. Let's bring you over to this side. We have an image of Martin Luther King here, and hopefully you can see those somewhat clearly. And then an image of a soldier. This is Vietnam with text here. So this is kind of a really great example of her technique. Corita Kent is extracting these images from popular magazines and incorporating them into her bold, graphic, colorful prints juxtaposed with text. So this states manpower, exclamation, and where have all the flowers gone? And this cites the lyrics of a folk song from the 1960s that was a response to the Vietnam War. Corita Kent was creating silk screens as early as the 1950s, but she was really influenced by her encounter with the work of Andy Warhol in 1962. He had his first show in Los Angeles at Ferris Gallery, where she was able to view his Campbell Soup series, and really appreciated his combination of sort of everyday objects, elements of everyday life, and really interesting visual graphics. So many of the artists in the show combine imagery from mass media that they then appropriate and adapt in their work to expose truths, power, oppressive structures, injustices. And so this is another work that, like Corita Kent's series of prints, pulls from popular culture and mass media. So you can see here, this is sort of an inversion of a flag. We have stripes that almost one might associate with the American flag, and this tricolor suite of canvases, green, yellow, and red, that one might associate with Pan-African flags. The image that you see here is a film still from the film adaptation of Harper Lee's novel, To Kill a Mockingbird. So the film itself was made in 1962, and the book was set in 1930s. And the book itself really explored issues of race and justice in the 1930s. And by capturing this still, the artist Annette Lemieux, the creator of this work, is kind of reflecting back on the racial conditions in which she grew up in the 1960s and 70s in Virginia, and that continued to persist today. So the image itself depicts one of the child protagonists, Scout, in a wheel and a tire, and she's being wheeled by her brother. In this scene, she begins to roll uncontrollably into the yard of her neighbor, Boo Radley. So this feeling of sort of impending danger is suggested by the image from this scene. So I'm just going to pan remaining works. This is one suite of images that I do want to stop on, thinking about women artists responding to social and political conditions of the 60s and 70s. This is a particularly important series by the artist Martha Rosler. And this is a series entitled House Beautiful, Bringing the War Home. And you'll see the two on the right are more historic images. They're black and white from 1967 and 1972. And you might be able to recognize on the left, these are more contemporary images. So these derive from this pioneering series of photo collages that Martha Rosler began in the 1960s, entitled House Beautiful, Bringing the War Home. They were made during the height of the Vietnam War, and the works juxtapose Time magazine's documentation of the conflict with images from House Beautiful, which was a home decor publication of the time. And using a Xerox machine to create the collages, Rosler contrasts the prosperity of post-war America with the brutality of the Vietnam conflict to connect two sides of human experience that she believes have been falsely separated, the distant wars and the living rooms of America. And these were not initially made for display in art contexts. Martha Rosler would photocopy these and distribute them at pro-peace, anti-war protests in the 1960s and 70s. I'll pan a little bit closer to the other two. These are from a more recent iteration of the series. So between 2003 and 2008, Rosler returned to House Beautiful series after the United States initiated wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. She created new photo montages with a distinctly 21st century feel that raised question about sexism and violence. So we see not only images of sort of luxurious interiors. This is Saddam's palace. So this is an image of combat and of the front lines. But we also see images of women depicted in these sort of stereotypical, either sexualized, objectified sort of depictions, or in these traditional roles as in domestic spaces. So here you have a woman using Febreze to clean the interior of the space. All right, so we'll just take a quick pan of the remaining works. I'm not going to speak about them just yet because we still have another gallery to visit. So we have a few more works in this space by Mary Kelly, Nancy Sparrow, another Nancy Sparrow. Okay, and also some prominent artists from the 1970s until today. We have Ana Mendieta, and works by John Quick-to-See Smith. And these also respond to issues that emerged in the 1970s, participation in the women's liberation movement, response to the Vietnam War, and so we'll have one last part. Very vocal in her participation in pro-peace efforts was Yoko Ono, and you'll encounter a few of Yoko Ono's works throughout the show. One of her posters that was created in collaboration with her late husband, John Lennon, War is Over, is included in that gallery. As I mentioned, her Imagine Peace flag is installed in front of the building on our flagpole. And here in our Vance gallery, you'll see her really beautiful wish tree. And this is a work that she conceived in 1996 and has reinstalled in many different iterations around the world. And Wish Tree is her kind of collaborative invitation to the visitor to participate in the creation of a work by taking a small tag and a pencil that you'll find at the side of the gallery, and to think about a wish. Write it down, and then hang it on the branches of these trees, of this tree. So you'll see in just a matter of about a week, we've had really extraordinary participation, and the wishes are really beautiful. I'll read maybe just a few because you can see them. All art is available to all for free. That's one wish. I wish for more understanding and tolerance, more love. And so the wishes address things personal, universal. So I really hope that everybody feels inspired and compelled to come and be part of this, this artwork. Through the course of the exhibition, as the tree fills up, the wishes are occasionally pruned off. And at the end of the exhibition, all of the wishes are compiled and returned to Yoko Ono, where she archives them in her Peace Tower, which is in Iceland. It's a monument to peace. And over the course of this work, since its conception in 1996, she has compiled over 1 million wishes. So you can be part of that archive. I hope you will be. All right, so we now leave the 70s and we enter Stitzer Gallery, which brings us to the 1980s. And a lot of artists who emerged in the 1980s and who are still very prominent today. So I just want to, again, sort of pan the space to orient you. And then we'll look a little bit more closely. So these are artists who emerged in the 1980s, sort of amid a technology boom, consumer boom, commercialist boom. Images are proliferating on the TV, on the internet, on video, on billboards. And so what many of the artists of the time are doing is they are sort of appropriating marketing strategies and utilizing those visual strategies in their own work. So as we saw with Corita Kent and with Annette Lemieux and some of the artists that we explored in the first gallery, these women artists are drawing from mass media, from popular culture, using advertising and marketing strategies to spread messages of social change, address inequalities, expose biases and prejudices in their work, often with humor, as we'll see. And so throughout the show, as you read the sort of section texts, we're reminded again of the historical ephemera from the women's suffrage movement and the strategies that were used in many of those posters. We see many of those strategies in use 60 years later, 70 years later. So on this first wall, we have t-shirts by Jenny Holzer. And they feature very simple messages. Abuse of power comes as no surprise. All things are delicately interconnected. Raise boys and girls the same. So Jenny Holzer often draws from either original texts or appropriated texts that address abuse of power and gender issues, identity issues. And these are from her series of truisms, which were phrases that were meant to inspire but also provoke. And so by printing them on t-shirts, she's kind of playing with sort of commercial strategies of getting logos out there into the public view, into the public domain. So you can choose to wear these sort of ideas, promote these ideas or not. So I also want to bring you to one of my favorite works in the show. I'm going to bring you a little bit closer. We have a little bit of reflection because we're opposite of a large window. Okay, I hope you can see this work fairly well. For me, this work by Barbara Kruger, entitled Untitled, We Will No Longer Be Seen and Not Heard, from 1985, captures much of the spirit of resistance that I feel carries through much of the exhibition from beginning to end. And this really, in a way, could be sort of a flagship image of the show, because like those posters and bulletins that we saw from the women's suffrage movement, Barbara Kruger's work juxtaposes text and imagery in really simple but powerful ways. So the work starts at the top corner, and each print includes a word, and read together, the work spells, "We will no longer be seen and not heard." So in the context of this exhibition, we can think about the perspective of women suffragists, women artists fighting for social change will no longer be seen and not heard, getting your voices out there, being heard. But this is the type of work that the viewer can kind of look at and think about whose perspective is being represented here. And I liked it, that ambiguity in Barbara Kruger's work. She is someone who came from a history working as a graphic designer and an art director, so very much applies those sort of marketing aesthetics and strategies to her work. All right. I'm noticing it's 1:43, so I'll try to keep things as concise as possible, but I'm really, really proud to share with you this suite of posters from the Guerrilla Girls Portfolio Complete 1985 to 2016. This is the most recent acquisition made by the New Britain Museum of American Art, and the acquisition comprises 110 protest posters by the Guerrilla Girls, who were an artist collective established in 1985 to fight discrimination. And they really focused their sights on the art world. And in many ways, I think that a lot of the artists in the show are addressing oppressive structures or racism, gender bias. But I think that the Guerrilla Girls were some of the most effective in terms of actually enacting change, because what they did was they looked at the practices of museums and galleries, and they published statistics in terms of how many women had one-person exhibitions at New York City museums last year. And we see these sort of dismal statistics: Guggenheim 0, Metropolitan Museum of Art 0, the Museum of Modern Art 1, and Whitney 0. And so what they did was they published these posters, they protested around the museums, they distributed these, and the stats were embarrassing. And as one writer stated, critic Susan Tallman wrote of the Guerrilla Girls' efforts in 1991. She says, "These posters were rude, they named names and printed statistics, and almost always cited the source of those statistics at the bottom, making them difficult to dismiss. They embarrassed people. In other words, they worked." So we're really thrilled to bring this work into our collection. Okay, we have some really great works by Martha Rosler. And I want to bring you over to this diptych by Jenny Holzer. So we looked at her t-shirts just a moment ago, and I want to take you to these photographs that just demonstrate the kind of range that Jenny Holzer demonstrates in her work. So she's getting these messages out in public domain through t-shirts, through print campaigns, through apparel, through LED sculptures, which she's perhaps best known for, but also for ephemeral light projections made at night. And so these two are documentations of night projections that she does, in which she casts these light projections onto corporate buildings. And as I mentioned, she uses both original and appropriated texts. The texts in these two works are from poems by Nobel Prize winning writer, a Polish writer, and each one deals with war and torture. So you see here, no sound bites, no photo opportunities, and it takes years. All the cameras have gone to other wars. Also combining text and image is Carrie Mae Weems' Not Mayonnaise Type. Carrie Mae Weems is an incredible artist who often looks at the canon of Western art, looking at the masters whose works are celebrated, who are part of the Western art canon, as well as the way in which women have been depicted throughout history, often as objects for sort of objects of beauty, passively available for reflection. And so she was aware that women were also often depicted in these sort of passive sort of situations and in which they were objectified. But she also noted that African-American women were often completely absent from Western art. So I'll just read briefly. This is called, again, Not Mayonnaise Type. And she writes, and you'll see each image includes a self-portrait. So she is acting as muse in each work. She writes, standing on shaky ground, I posed myself for critical study, but was no longer certain of the questions to ask. It was clear I was not Manet's type, Picasso, who had a way with women, only used me, and Duchamp never even considered me. But it could have been worse. Imagine my fate had de Kooning gotten hold of me. So she's going through these celebrated male artists. I knew not from memory, but from hope that there were other models by which to live by. I took a tip from Frida Kahlo, she's referencing, who from her bed painted incessantly, beautifully, while Diego scaled the scaffolds to the very top of the world. So kind of ending with this reference to a celebrated woman artist to whom Carrie Mae Weems will look to as her sort of model or heroine. All right, so we're now at the final section of the exhibition, and you can see we transition in color, and every section in the show is sort of defined by a different color. And so in this last section, we are looking at work by contemporary artists, by Gen X or millennial artists, many of whom are first generation or second generation Americans. So they are considering questions of citizenship, the legacies of voting, issues that we face today from cross-cultural perspectives. And one thing that was very interesting about organizing this show in the past year was that it was originally slated to open in August of this past summer. And because of our closure due to COVID, we had to push back the show. But in addition to that, we also had time to have more extensive conversations with the artists and lenders. And as we were responding to this global pandemic and following the murder of George Floyd and the protests that arose in response to the racial violence, we were actually able to the show evolved to kind of reflect some of these issues in real time. So we were actually able to include works that addressed things that are happening right now and bring this up to very contemporary time. So sort of quintessential example of that is this neon work by Colleen Smith, whose banners we saw in that first gallery. And she has recently embarked on this series of neons, often dedicated to Black women who are the victims of police violence. And this is titled Light Up My Life for Sandra Bland. It was created in 2020. And here she conflates two phrases. I will light you up, which was taken from the widely circulated video of the late Sandra Bland, during which the 28-year-old African-American was pulled over for what appeared to be a regular traffic stop, but which escalated to an aggressive confrontation in which a trooper pointed a taser in her direction and threatened, I will light you up. And Sandra Bland was later taken into police custody and died 3 days later. The other phrase that we see is something a bit more positive. It's taken from the title of singer Debbie Boone's 1977 ballad, You Light Up My Life, a song that during Smith's youth conjured up quintessential American ideals for the artist. So by conflating these two statements, Smith casts into relief racially charged experiences while also inverting threatening language and rendering it more positive. So we have a second neon that is a sort of follow-up to this first one. So we'll return to Colleen Smith in a moment. We have a number of beautiful works by Egyptian-born artist Ghada Amer, who became known for her really beautifully executed embroidered works on canvas that marry craft with fine art. And in this series, she is appropriating feminist texts. So this first one, we see Simone de Beauvoir's famous statement, "One is not born, but rather becomes a woman," talking about femininity as a social construct. And in this, a quote by Timothy Leary, "Women who seek to be equal to men lack ambition." So we have a few of these. You can really appreciate the vibrant colors. Here we have a suite of works by Martín Gutiérrez, who is a trans artist of Guatemalan and American descent, and who has created an extraordinary fashion magazine in which Martín acted as editor, art director, model, makeup artist, and as a way to be able to sort of control the way in which her identity was presented, and as a way to talk about indigeneity, to celebrate that kind of cross-cultural heritage as part of her Americanness, as part of a woman living in America today. Here's a second neon by Colleen Smith, Sunshine for Brayla, Mercy, Shaki, Drea, Tatiana, Bree, Ria, Dominique, 2020. And this was made in honor of 8 trans Black women who were murdered in 2020. So through neon, she's kind of literally using light to illuminate these violent conflicts and to perhaps seek some enlightenment. She describes that this song for her, Everybody Loves Sunshine, which this neon quotes, was an R&B song released in 1976. And that for her, she says, she made this work because she was trying to move from the trauma of Sandra Bland into something ascendant. The state-sanctioned violence is not going anywhere soon, but our interior lives can go anywhere, anytime. And so for her, she talks about how this song always kind of felt ascendant to her, brought her to a sort of positive space. We have 2 remarkable works by Mickalene Thomas. I'm going to try to back up so you can appreciate the scale. And Mickalene Thomas is known for her depictions, her very empowering depictions of Black women. So no longer are they depicted as maybe traditionally in Western canon as sort of passive objects of beauty. Rather, Mickalene's figures look directly at the viewer. And while she's known mostly for portraiture, we have this monumental work by Mickalene entitled Resist that reveals her engagement with the genre of history painting. So this work is created using her sort of signature materials, including rhinestones, silkscreen, and so there's sort of a luxurious quality to the work, but in fact, it captures much of the racial tension that has characterized recent months, recent years, and in fact, the last century of American history. Depicted throughout the canvas are images appropriated from civil rights marches, as well as James Baldwin here, and film stills from his recent film, I Am Not Your Negro. In the center here, we have an iconic image of this young African-American boy being attacked by a police dog. So by creating this work, she is sort of situating her subject within both a larger historical context and today's most critical ongoing conversations about race, identity, and gender in America. All right. This is another one of my favorite works in the show. This is by Mexican-born artist Eliza Nissenbaum. And this work is titled MOIA's New York City Women's Cabinet 2016. This is a large group portrait that depicts the 15 women, including Nissenbaum herself, who's seen here, who participated in the inaugural Immigrant Women Leaders Fellowship Program at the New York Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs in 2016. So we see the manner in which she layers the women. They feel kind of united together, empowered, and really reflecting a very diverse America. Sort of a picture of what the American woman might be today. We have a suite of works by Filipino-American artist Stephanie Sayjuco, and she teaches at a university in California, and she often works with her students. Here she is shrouded, one of her students who is who received her college education through DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. And because of her precarious status in this contemporary moment, she has been shrouded in this fabric. And the pattern that you see here, it's a sort of checkered pattern, refers to a tool on Photoshop called the transparency tool. And you can see it's a bit checkered. So by referring to this sort of Photoshop tool that renders an object or part of a photograph transparent, she's also referring to the student's status, somewhat invisible or transparent. This is called color checker pileup. And this refers in many ways to the many colors beyond the iconic red, white, and blue. And I really love this work, which is called Chroma Key Aftermath. And so we see here the trappings of a rally or a parade or demonstration, including celebratory ticker tape and two figures with pennants. The cause of the gathering is unknown. And in place of identifiable banners with legible associations, Sayjuco instead fabricates the scene entirely of bright green chroma key color, which is sort of the green screen. And by using green screen, she is sort of referring to how the media representations of public protests can distort and manipulate meaning in that a green screen allows you to project any sort of image upon its surface. So this could be any political rally, any sort of cause that they're fighting for. And I think we have our last work is we're having some technical difficulty on this one. So you'll have to come back and see that. It's a compilation of works by Jenny Holzer from a 2018 work called Vote Your Future, and depicts a large truck that was used as a billboard that projected messages to inspire people to get out and vote. What are causes that people are voting for today, raising questions about civic engagement. And so the hope is that you travel this exhibition, you see how artists responded to certain conditions of the time, how women were really trying to work for women's empowerment as well as social justice against the backdrop of the civil rights movement, Vietnam War, women's liberation, as well as all that we're facing in today's times, and really bring you back to the agency that you can practice to as a citizen to cast your ballot. And so the fact that this show happens concurrent to the election was completely accidental and a result of our COVID closure. But in the end, it allows us to be able to bring greater attention to our agency as citizens, and how artists have brought attention to the importance of that through their work. So I'm sorry if I've gone over time. It's a big show, there's a lot of work, and we're really excited to share it all with you. I welcome any questions, and if not, I encourage everyone to come see the show. All right, thank you everyone, thanks so much. Please tune in for some forthcoming programs. We have, as I mentioned earlier, scholar Allison Lang coming to speak on her new book entitled Picturing Political Power, Images from the Women's Suffrage Movement. That's on October 14th. In November, we're really excited to bring the Guerrilla Girls here to do some virtual programming. They'll be doing a lecture gig on November 19th, and on November 20th, a workshop. So very, very excited for those and other forthcoming programs. So thank you again, and hope to see you at the museum.